Shall we start? So good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome as well from the Master of International Relations, Security and Development. Thank you very much for coming. And first of all, a huge thanks goes to the team of the IEMed who has made it all possible, who has organized and planned meticulously this fantastic interdisciplinary research seminar. And of course, I also very much would like to thank our presenters who have kindly accepted our invitation to take part in our panel on From Exceptionalism to Normalization, the Radical Transformation of the Republic of Turkey. I'm very excited to have you all here, and I'm very much looking forward to your presentations. Özge Özdizen is going to be our first presenter. She has received her PhD from the Media Department at Edgehill University in Ormskirk, England, and she's currently the British Academy's Newton International Postdoctoral Fellow at the Institute for Diplomacy and International Governments at Loughborough University in London. Her research concentrates on the spatial uses of arts, media, and performance in the post-Occupy era in Turkey, examining particularly park activism. And there she's looking at the spatial dynamics of Occupy Gezi anniversaries, activists' engagement with and participation in cultural and political events in political parks and online geographies. In this sense, she's going to present to us her paper about spatial and visual activism in post-occupation Gezi Park, shifting geographies of online, offline political expression in authoritarian Turkey. And our second presenter is Sevgi Adak. Sevgi holds a PhD from the School of Middle Eastern Studies at Leiden University. She's currently assistant professor at the Aga Khan University Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations in London. Her main research interests are women and gender in modern Turkey, women's history on contemporary feminisms in the Middle East, Turkish politics, history of modern Turkey, politics of secularism in Turkey, as well as state-society relations in the Middle East. She also has a book coming out in connection to her research that is called Anti-Wheeling Campaigns in Turkey, Gender, Power and Resistance under the Kemalist Regime. And she's going to present to us her paper on desecularization and state transformation in Turkey, Diyanet, familialism, and the expansion of the religious sphere. And our third presenter is going to be Eduard Soler. Eduard is senior researcher at CEDOP, the Barcelona Center for International Affairs. Eduard holds a PhD in international relations from the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona. That's the autonomous university here in Barcelona. And his main research and areas of expertise are the Euro-Mediterranean relations, Turkish foreign and domestic politics, North African and Middle Eastern political dynamics, as well as Spain's Mediterranean policy and security cooperation in the Mediterranean. And Eduard has done extensive research on Turkey, I should add. And his presentation is titled Turkish Foreign Policy in the Middle East, Radical Transformation or Fine-Tuning. We're going to have about 20 minutes per presenter, and then this is followed by a question and answer session of about 30 minutes at the end. So let me give the word to Özge now.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting us, and thank you all for coming. Today I'm going to present my paper, Spatial and Visual Activism in Post-Occupy Gezi Park. Today I'm not going to talk about the offline part that much because of the offline activism in the post-Occupy era that much. I will retain my concentration on the, online activism that much. I'm going to retain my presentation on offline park activism, but we'll be talking about visual activism during and after Gezi Park occupations. First of all, it might seem that people in Turkey are called into are called into silence from 2015 onwards, since the two general elections and the failed coup in July 2016. But this paper investigates political voice, existing political voice, following the Gezi Park protests that happened August 2013. My paper relies on Istanbul-based activists' use of special use of parks and media. It is concerned with the ways in which placemaking was the most important strategy in the newly formed political geographies in the center of Istanbul, specifically Kadıköy, Beşiktaş, and Taksim Square. Activists transformed these spaces into political parks, where they formed novel ways of protesting and community making. Instigated vernacularization and visibility while creating do-it-yourself media arts. Taksim Square, in the history of modern Turkey, has always been a multivalent site and an identity place for contentious politics in Turkey. But rather than isolating the protest to Gezi Park, the articulation of everywhere as the all-encompassing political geography of resistance during the Gezi Park protests led to the formation of park occupations across Turkey. The Gezi was formed as an opposition to top-down urban restructuring programs and the commodification of urban space in Istanbul, and opened new possibilities in challenging growing authoritarianism in Turkey. The anti-capitalist dimension was a really noteworthy characteristic of the Gezi, such as the boycotts of banks and shopping malls during the occupation. But I argue that its driving force was the alienation of non-conservative citizens from the AKP government, the current government, which represent a social force opposed to AKP's construction of a new collective identity and political regime, the New Turkey. During the uprising, a variety of different groups coalesced, created a park culture, and instigated networks of solidarity to deal with various implications of the New Turkey. The specific anxieties caused by the authoritarian government brought together groups that had little or no prior affiliation in Turkey's history, such as Kurds, Alevis, Kemalists, anti-capitalist Muslims, feminists, LGBTI communists, urban chambers in the political parks. My paper today points out the spatial strategies remaining from the Gezi, such as occupations, participatory methods like forums, creative dissidents like political concerts, do-it-yourself festivals or plays, which have been persistent in shaping the post-Occupy activism after the Gezi Park. Gezi's children, I argue, that continued to use political parks not only to go against Islamist neoliberalism in Turkey, but also to question the sustainability and effectiveness of some of the Gezi's ongoing set of everyday practices, such as the forum structure or its very own organizational dynamics. This research makes the case for how activists engage with emergent sites of social movements, not only at their peak, but also within other cycles of movements, and is based on two phases of ethnographic research conducted in Istanbul from 2013 to 2017 with the children of the Gezi. I'm not going to go into detail on my theoretical backdrop, but this is my main kind of theoretical background. My early observations dates back to my doctoral thesis, in which I investigated cultural activism. My special ethnography for this research commenced in 2015, followed by my ethnographic interviews and participant observation during the Gezi commemorations, anniversaries, and Gezi-related events and demonstrations at the parks in 2016 and 17, to trace in what ways Gezi's media, communities, and methods in key spaces persisted. With my place-based ethnographic in-depth interviews, I reached out 31 leading activists of Gezi protests and key members of civil societies and media communities, remaining active about Gezi-related activities in the parks and other independent spaces. These are the main groups that I interacted with. Rather than concentrating on only one group, I kept my focus with an interaction on with various groups that remained active about the Gezi protests. The Taksim Solidarity network was the kind of the most important group that was kind of organizing the Gezi Park protests, but other groups were active and they were consistently active in the aftermath of Gezi protests as well. These are the groups. I'm not going to go into detail. To little bit give you a little bit context about AKP in Turkey. Islamist neoliberalism in Turkey actually started during Özal's period, after the coup d'etat in 1980, later benefiting from the local governments of the Welfare Party after 1994, which was the first party actually to adopt political Islam as its goal. This was an outcome of military coup and the neoliberal economic policies of the Özal era since the mid-1980s that relied on privatization of all sectors. The key members of the AKP, such as Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, were members of the Welfare Party in the 1990s. So I argue that a deeper, following Bozkurt Güngön, I argue that a deeper authoritarianism was embedded in the neoliberal experience in Turkey, which facilitated the expansion of authoritarian repertoire under the AKP governments. After June 2015 elections in which AKP lost its hegemony due to power, the pro-Kurdish party HDP gained. AKP bolstered its authoritarianism with overt coercion against all oppositional social forces. From its early day onwards, AKP also initiated a construction-based growth model beginning in 2002. As neoliberal urban policies are used to legitimize the enhancement of authoritarian governments, and AKP governments use urban areas as growth machines, but also as grounds for a socio-political transformation project, New Turkey. During the late AKP periods, I mean after 2007, aggressive construction sector-led policies and projects spread to vast and widespread areas, such as mega projects or hydroelectric power plants, while the bulldozer neoliberalism in Istanbul operated all around the city, from the periphery to the center, to transform it not only as a center of commerce, tourism and business, but also to Islamize Istanbul, so that it symbolizes the new brand, the new regime. Furthermore, Aksaran Hawks described the post-2007 media environment in Turkey as conservative, redistributive, panoptic, and discriminatory media autocracy, which includes YouTube and Twitter bans, the arrests of journalists, the phone tapping of political figures, etc. The media became the main propaganda device for AKP governments, and the existing alternative media outlets have been heavily pressured. As with the Gezi's aim to go against the neoliberal and Islamist policies of AKP by using parks across Turkey, ongoing special strategies continue to challenge multiple aspects of authoritarian urban politics by instigating special strategies of urban resistance. In the same manner with the Gezi experience, the first year of Gezi anniversaries in 2014 was marked by the multiplicity of intersectional alliances, such as those between environmental organizations, political parties, and anti-capitalist groups. The traditional characteristics of the Gezi commemorations took place, like demonstrations, took place on Taksim Square and the Istiklal streets, whilst the cultural components of commemorations, such as the Gezi Festival and forums, took place at Abbas Ağa Park, Yoğurtçu Park, and Don Quixote squads. Mücella Yapıcı from Union of Chambers, TMOP is an abbreviation of Union of Chambers of Turkish Engineers and Architects, which was a highly active group during the Gezi protests and continued to be an active participant of any urban struggles in Istanbul and beyond. Mücella Yapıcı was active in the organization of annual events on anniversary dates of the Gezi and participated in wide-ranging activities of Gezi-related activities. She says, people learned to go out of their own neighborhoods. They made use of and protected somewhere that they may not even use normally, such as Taksim. Activists organized art workshops and even practiced yoga in the parks. Women's and LGBTI movements were so powerful at the parks, they organized workshops against sexist swearing. All decisions were taken in forums, not via voting, but through solidarity. Forums in the parks were the most important contribution of the Gezi protests. As I said, Union of Chambers of Turkish Engineers and Architects represented those who opposed commodification of urban land. As the head of Environmental Issues Research Center and spokesperson of the Taksim Solidarity Network, Yapıcı became one of the most important voices of park forums and Gezi-related demonstrations. She highlighted the importance of cultural and creative component of Gezi as a new addition to the repertoire of protest movements in Turkey. She underlined how vernacularization and horizontal alliances were the key during and after the protests, generating new ways of relating to others, especially for people not previously involved in political activism. Because of her practical work in the parks during the uprising, Mücella Yapıcı was taken into custody along with other members of Taksim Solidarity Network. Currently, she is also charged a life sentence as an alleged organizer of the protests. Gül Köksal from Academics for Peace, again from TMOP and No Platforms, whom actively use the parks following the Gezi as an urban and academic activist, defined the vitality of parks for activist communities and the public. The fact that events take place at the parks mean that they are open to the public and therefore more visible and transparent, unlike the actions of the power holders in the parliament. The pastors can hear and participate in the debates. Istanbul and Ankara Solidarity Academies organize meetings and lectures in parks, which implies that we can transform where we are, that includes the streets. The government declared a state of emergency, which became the norm, for 3 months immediately following the attempted coup, and has renewed it for 2 years. I mean 2 years, but now it's not too different, even after its kind of end. Following the coup attempt, state authorities have targeted thousands of academics and administrative personnel for dismissal through emergency decrees. Since the Academics for Peace, which my informant Gül Köksal is a member, signed the petition, we will not be a party to this crime in January 2016. In order to support peace in the Kurdish region of Turkey, some of the signatories were fired from their jobs, some of their passports were cancelled, some of them were taken into custody or imprisoned. Despite this coercion, members of this community formed street academies in the parks, which is also an extension of the Gezi protests, I believe, with an aim to continue teaching, create visibility, reach out to public, and most importantly, claim their rights to spaces and also education, which has been one of the projects of the AKP governments. Parks also became primary location for the organization of media communities against the all-encompassing AKP mainstream media during the Gezi protests, impact of which persisted in its aftermath. Onur Doğulu articulates this pattern and speaks about the do-it-yourself media practices during and following the protests. We decided to form a Karşı radio, that's a counter radio, when we camped at the Gezi Park and fought together. There was a problem of communication such as the internet blockage due to lots of people trying to connect simultaneously or the government's consistent attack on social media. Then we set up our own radio. In our radio community, there is no written code or hierarchy. This type of amateur and do-it-yourself production, along with non-hierarchical organization, were the essence of Gezi, and it still is. Counter radio brought together many communities involving in programs on not only social movements, but also culture of music, film, or sports. And it was consisted of communities that were not professional radio programmers at all. Like other organizations of the Gezi protests, counter radio effectively used decentralized and horizontal organization as it formed at the parks. In line with the opportunities of community making, visibility and vernacularization at political parks, the spokesperson of the anti-capitalist Muslims, İhsan Eli Açık, who has also been a kind of symbol of the Gezi protests, said, "One of the most important happenings at the Gezi Park was the Miraj celebration and the following Friday prayer. When we came up with the idea of organizing this at the park, we were a bit worried within and beyond our community if this would be an exploitation of religion. But when Erdogan accused the protesters of drinking alcohol in a mosque and assaulting a woman wearing a hijab, we stopped discussing this and agreed to practice our everyday religious rituals in the parks to show that it wasn't only religious minorities, but also Muslims who were, non-religious minorities, but also Muslims who were protesting against the government. We were hundreds of people praying on the ground while hippies, metal fans, and atheists formed a chamber around us to protect us from the police forces." This defied the government's claim that Gezi was actually a homogeneous protest, and it reflected the pluralism of the Gezi. Like other groups in the parks, the anti-capitalist Muslims formed alliances with a variety of political and cultural groups and received wider participation and recognition. In addition to earth tables, this is an example of earth tables that they organized. Earth tables against capitalism, and that constituted of fasting on the grounds in front of five-star hotels as a way of protesting the logic in front of five-star hotels and political parks. As a way of protesting the logic of Islamism and capitalism at the same time. The anti-capitalist Muslims were at the forefront of the other public demonstrations in and beyond parks in Istanbul. Partly different from my other informants or other political communities that I interacted with, anti-capitalist Muslims appropriated not only the parks in the popular centers of Istanbul, but like Abbas Ağa Park, but also used parks around more conservative centers of Istanbul, like Fatih Saraçhane Park. This way, they were able to form vernacular encounters with the conservative populace of Istanbul. However, in 2018, İhsan Eli Açık, the leader of the anti-capitalist Muslims, was sentenced to 6 years prison in March 2018 and was banned from leaving Istanbul during the appeals periods. Regardless of the repression of the regime, Karaca identifies how contemporary arts from Turkey over the past 15 years, largely centered on political works, the explicitly political artworks became a major currency in the circulation of art, and the way silencing mechanisms work leads to a high visibility of censorship and creates visible responses. During and following the protest, political media arts, such as videos or music, were used as a panacea for the homogenizing authoritarian politics. As part of the proliferation of the do-it-yourself and independent political art production and its circulation, Istanbul transformed into a video city during the Gezi protests, recording events from within the occupied parks and other public spaces, reinforced the sense of sharing and solidarity whilst consolidating activists' understanding of do-it-yourself citizenship. One of my participants, Imre Azam, whose documentary Ecumenopolis became the most screened film in the protest camps as it portrayed top-down urban regeneration programs in Istanbul and also bottom-up responses to it right before the Gezi. Talking about his more recent documentary, Azam said, "My film, Turkey on the Edge, built connections between Gezi's places and other resistances, such as the Kurdish resistance. I want to draw attention to ongoing resistance even in the face of the repression of the AKP, and it's not coming to terms with the loss on the June 2015 elections. No platforms that I portrayed in the film are the remnants of the Gezi protests. The no assemblies generally gathered in the parks, as well as wedding halls and union offices, as the campaigns coincided with the winter. Although not all the spaces were Gezi's own spaces, the plural and inclusive spirit of Gezi was always there in the campaign. Azam participated in the do-it-yourself citizenship by creating films and videos on various issues from no campaigns against Erdogan's presidency to the Kurdish issue. Like other research participants, Gezi protest became a trademark moment in his understanding of visual activism. To capture his the change in his ways of combating the authoritarian state, which is kind of like representative of other video and film activists. I focus on two of his videos from 2014 and 2017. Actually, the LGBTI, you could start the 2014. You will see that this captures the Pride from 2014, one of Imre Azam's widely circulated videos. In 2014, as you can see, it's right after the Gezi protest. The video shows this resistance using long shots to capture the density of crowds. And you could see like wide-ranging kind of activists and LGBTI communities participating. It shows the clothes, the banners, the slogans you can't hear, but all of these kind of different, aspects of the resistance. Whereas The video from 2017, the touchstone of this video is the vivid colors revealed through LGBTI individuals' costumes, their banners, their, flags. But you could pass to 1917. But the video, the camera captures the grayness of the concrete. This is his video after 3 years, after the coup d'etat and the state of emergency. So actually, this is on the day of the Pride walks, and rather than portraying the crowds with long shots, the video could only take some interviews, and if you continue along with the video, you will see a lot of LGBTI communities and other activists passing by in front of the camera, and the police obviously follows them, follows the suspects. So rather than a colorful kind of setting, you'll see the camera captures grayness of concrete buildings and the blackness of police uniforms in 2017, which shows the changing activist climate in these 3 years. This is not to say that activism in a way is completely blocked. Activists continue to use visual and spatial kind of ways to combat the authoritarian politics of the AKP regime. Nowadays, video activists and documentary filmmakers cannot fully follow political prisoners and activists inside the courthouses or prisons, as cameras and phones are not allowed. To combat mechanisms of institutional exclusion, some activists a lot of activists actually, started to draw sketches from these places to visually narrate the situation. You could see up above the drawing of Zeynep. I will just talk from top to bottom about all these images. The first drawing is Zeynep Özatalay's drawing from 2017, capturing one of the hunger strikers, Semih Özakça. Just to take their jobs back, these activists were on hunger strike for a long time, and this became this kind of visually narrating the story, the activist kind of path within courthouses or in prisons have been an ongoing trend. So Zehra Doğan, the second year, depicted the Kurdish artist, depicted from prison, who was in prison for just because of her Twitter, the sharing of her views on Twitter. She drew from the Baby Sise and Dersim Ana from Tarsus prison, which were widely shared on social media. And these 3 images at the bottom are visuals from last week. This last week, a Turkish court handed down jail sentences totaling 159 years for lawyers who are members of Progressive Lawyers Association over membership in an armed terrorist organization. And Murat Boşol drew, because none of the videos or cameras or were allowed, or phones, he drew all the courts, the lawyers' courts, by these images, and they were widely circulated on media, which also shows the placemaking practices of activists. Other than film, visual arts, and video communities, theater collectives also use parks to go beyond homogenizing efforts of the AKP government. I have only a couple of minutes left, so I'm not going to go into detail. But as you can see, Ece Tekbulut, one of the plays that was groups that was active in the parks to stage their political plays. She was kind of celebrating the non-organizational aspect of the Gezi protest. But a lot of my other activists also widely criticized the non-organizational aspect of the Gezi protest. For them, for instance, Beyza Metin from, again, Taksim Solidarity, and MEP is an abbreviation for Labour Party. She said the movement failed due to lacking such an organizational logic. my informants continued to question why Gezi couldn't, in fact, I mean, we protected the Gezi Park, they were saying, but why didn't it work beyond the protection of the Gezi protest? Because it wasn't only aimed for the protection of a park. And my other activists, such as Can Atalay, again, United June movements and Taksim Solidarity, and he's the lawyer of all these activist movements. He said, you know, we couldn't, like, because of the, he was really, really critical about why it couldn't work. He accepted that it's harsh times, but you know, we needed to go beyond that because we couldn't put political targets beyond these political parks and beyond these areas. We couldn't succeed. So to just conclude, yes, although the Gezi became the largest and most dramatic protest movement in the recent history of Turkey, ensuing social movements remained comparably small in the face of increasing authoritarianism. Despite smaller in scope, however, these social movements have been a consistent force in tackling AKP's authoritarian politics, which is even obvious in yesterday's elections. I mean, it shows how vernacular organizational logic of all these Gezi-related protests, and as well as Kurdish movements have persisted and fed each other, and all these movements that had no prior affiliation that connected in the Gezi Park continue to challenge the AKP government. And my research also goes against the understanding of no political mobilization in authoritarian regimes. I also argued that Gezi's children not only questioned, you know, the government's obvious repressive policies on media or in, you know, urban space, but also they started to question their own logic, their own organizational legacy, so on and so forth. Yes, I think I should stop here. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Okay, now we give the word to Sevgi Adak.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you again for the organizers, and especially for Olivia and Elizabeth for patiently answering our questions over email, and thank you all for coming. I think this is the most beautiful room I've ever presented my work in, so it's really a great pleasure to be here and also to be in this wonderful city of Barcelona, which kind of, I think, resonates with, it has so many similarities with at least some of the aspects of Turkish politics. So Özge presented, I would say, a more colorful picture of the recent transformation of the Turkish society. I'm afraid I will be presenting on a more darker side from the perspective of the state and how the state had actually been pushing for religious reshaping of some of the fundamental dynamics in the society, but particularly my focus will be on the family policies and gender relations, family-related policies of the government and their attempt to reshaping of the gender relations. As has already been mentioned, Turkey has been experiencing a radical transformation of the state under the AKP government, and this transformation accelerated dramatically under the state of emergency measures since July 2016. Although the state of emergency has been lifted, an authoritarian political legal structure consolidated through these measures have in fact become the new normal. In this presentation, I would like to discuss an important component of state transformation in AKP's Turkey, that is the systematical expansion of the religious sphere, which I conceptualize here as desecularization. I argue that as one of the backbones of Turkey's transformation under the AKP rule, this desecularization has been underway before the recent exceptional period. That is to say, although the title of the panel says from exceptionalism to normalization, what I argue here is that some of the major dynamics of the transformation of the Turkish state that we have been witnessing since the Gezi Park protests were actually there before this sort of exceptional period. And in order to show this, or support my argument, I concentrate on the Directorate of Religious Affairs, and hereby, from now on, I will refer to it as the Diyanet. That's the Turkish name for the institution in the AKP era, as the main engine of desecularization, with its unprecedented expansion and transformation in the last 15 years. This process of desecularization is, of course, not limited to the activities of the Diyanet, or Diyanet is not the only milieu to see this process. One of the other areas that actually this process can be seen is education and the transformation of education policies under the AKP government. But in this paper, my aim is to show the crucial role of the Diyanet in the enforcement of AKP's counter-secularizing policies. I will suggest Diyanet's critical role stems not only from its institutional role, but also its role in the utilization of an ideology of familialism, as well as the dissemination of this ideology through religious services. Thus, although the Ministry of Family and Social Policy seems to be the main agent behind AKP's family-centered policies, the Diyanet plays, I argue, a more central role and a transformative role in the shaping of the family and gender codes along more religious lines, with its expanded capacity and through specific institutional channels created within its own body. Before discussing these institutional challenges, I would like to just a few words about how I see desecularization in this paper. So I don't have the time to go into the how I actually conceptualize desecularization here. Just very briefly, I will just mention that I'm following Slava Karpov's conceptualization that he developed based on the case of Russia, desecularization in Russia in the post-Soviet era. He built on the literature on the resilience of religion, global resilience of religion, but also particularly on Peter Berger's idea that not only that we see in the world in general as a sociological phenomenon a resilience of religion, but also some quite apparent counter-secularizing tendencies in the last decades. So Karpov builds on that. And also building on the Russian example, he comes up with an analytical discussion of desecularization as a sociological phenomena that is shaped by certain constitutive processes, and I will not go into these processes such as deprivatization of religion and so on and so forth. And he argues that depending on which factors you see in which case, and depending on who initiate this desecularization, we have a number of examples of desecularizations, patterns of desecularization across some cases. So I'm following here his conceptual discussion, and I argue that the AKP governments initiated a type of desecularization AKP government initiated in Turkey is a desecularization from above through implementing counter-secularizing policies mainly in the domains of education and families. So I argue that in order to see this desecularization, you have to look at how the state actually tries to penetrate, particularly in the private sphere. So familialism is a major component, ideological component of this process, but I argue that this particular focus of desecularization on family and education have significant repercussions on other domains of social and cultural life by creating particular institutional arrangements and mechanisms for this purpose, coupled with legitimizing discourses and campaigns for social mobilization. And here is a very important component of my analysis, without directly attempting to change the general secular legal framework of the state. So on the one hand, Turkey states constitutionally a secular state, and there's no attempt to change that. On the other hand, there is a clear and systematic effort to desecularize in the societal level, primarily through two channels, education and family policies. And the engine behind the family policies, I argue, is the Diyanet. So, the Diyanet, the institutional transformation of the Diyanet, and its attempt to increase its capacity and power is actually not new to the AKP era, and it's actually important to mention this. One of the first crucial shifts in terms of its institutional capacity came in 1965, when the Diyanet authority was extended to include the regulation of the moral sphere and religious education of the society, creating a rather ambiguous terrain for the activities of Diyanet to go beyond a strictly defined religious sphere. Another major shift came after the military coup of 1980, which expanded the reach of the Diyanet's activities beyond the borders of Turkey and positioned the institution as the representative of a Turkish Islam, with a vision guiding not only Turkish Muslims inside and outside Turkey, but also other Muslim communities through its extensive network of mosques, courses, and foundations outside Turkey. The most radical shift, however, came with the AKP government. The expansion in Diyanet's capacity as an institution, as well as the extent of its activities since the AKP came to power in 2002, is unprecedented. So, what are the main components of this unprecedented institutional expansion? One is that the status of Diyanet within the bureaucratic apparatus of the state has been elevated to the level of undersecretariat within the prime ministry. So Diyanet now ranks the 10th in the state protocol. This change in status has given the Diyanet a higher and more autonomous position. Number of head offices, departments, and personnel in the Diyanet bureaucracy has increased. Its share in the overall government budget increased from 0.6% in 2002, when AKP came to power, to 1.5% in 2017. This budget, just to give you an idea, in comparative terms, is 4 times bigger than the budget of Prime Ministry in 2017, and more than the budgets of 11 ministries in the cabinet, including Ministry of Economics, Ministry of Health, and Ministry of Culture. The number of its personnel reached, it's very difficult to locate how many personnel Diyanet has, because its official statistics that they publish in their website are actually quite not very well updated, I would say. And there are, as I understand, as somebody working on the Diyanet, there is formally employed personnel, but there are also an army of volunteers working for the Diyanet. But formally, at least, we have roughly, we can say, 120,000 personnel, which actually reflects a 50% increase since the AKP came to power, operating in about 88,000 mosques, and now I think almost reaching 40,000 Quran courses spread across the country. There has also been a significant extension of the duties and area of authority as a result of an introduction of a new law in 2010. This law also specified that the institution mission openly, and this is a quote from the law, to provide guidance and religious enlightenment for the family, women, and the youth, and thus provided a legal framework and support for Diyanet's increasing activities, mainly in the field of family relations and gender relations. And a particular, I think, difference of AKP's Diyanet is this attention diverted to the activities of the institution outside of the mosque. In other words, AKP's Diyanet can be seen as a Diyanet that has become active beyond its traditional sphere of influence and practice centered around mosques, and has embraced, in fact, quite novel roles in the wider social life of ordinary citizens. For example, the number of activities organized outside the mosques was reported to be 9,000 in Diyanet's 2013 annual report. This number had risen to 20,000 the following year. One of the specific target groups of these activities is the youth, to whom Diyanet tried to reach through two main channels: by creating youth organizations under the Mufti offices, so in the provinces and district capitals, and by signing a protocol with the Ministry of Youth and Sport, allowing the Diyanet to access the summer camps the Ministry of Sport organizes to educate participants on moral and religious values. Another dimension is the establishment of a 24-hour broadcasting Diyanet TV and the radio for the purpose of increasing Diyanet's public visibility and reach of its activities. And also there is a specific global mission defined to Diyanet, but perhaps maybe Eduard also will touch upon that. So I'm not going into detail of this in my own research, but there is a whole different story of what Diyanet has been doing outside Turkey. And it's as interesting as what they are doing inside Turkey. But perhaps the most ambitious and novel role the Diyanet assumed in the last decade is the implementation of governance family policy and policy towards women. The AKP's new family politics, officially characterized as strengthening the Turkish family policies, ascribed to Diyanet a new mission alongside the Ministry of Family and Social Policies. In other words, Diyanet is not a secondary institution helping the Ministry of Family. Rather, it's at the very center of the politics of family, directly shaping the content of the policies. One of the most significant characteristics of the new central law of Diyanet is the expansion of the religious sphere through feminization. Diyanet shapes and supports family-centered policies by increasing its women's personnel, its female personnel, by increasing women's participation and visibility in the religious domain, which is often characterized as the feminization of the religious sphere. Diyanet's new women's policy, and Diyanet openly refers to this as its women's policy, kadın politikası, and the institution itself explains this policy as reaching women through women. And to this aim, the Diyanet has been employing an increasing number of female personnel with its large bureaucracy. As of 2016, this is the official formal statistics, almost 18,000 women were employed in various positions in the Diyanet, an overwhelming majority being at the Mufti offices and other provincial organizations. In a very recent informal speech, the head of the Diyanet actually said that this number reached now 40,000, which reflects basically doubling of the number in the last 3 years. And he said, although of this 40,000 women, 25,000 are actually, he said, apparently formally employed, and the rest are what he describes as voluntary. Oh, no. Okay. Right. So I want to discuss very briefly two institutional challenges that have been created under the AKP in the Diyanet to actually proceed these policies. One is the employment of female preachers, which is actually quite novel compared to other Muslim majority countries as well. Again, I want to underline that this is not peculiar to the AKP era. There were actually already female preachers employed within the body of Diyanet before the coming of power of AKP, but their number were very symbolic, like 57 in 2001, 2002, whereas today, due to the systematic policy of the Diyanet under AKP to employ more women, we have now more than 800. Again, it's very difficult to locate the exact numbers, because after the coup d'etat, the state of emergency, a number of these female preachers were actually dismissed due to alleged link with the Gulen community, but they also keep hiring new female preachers, so I really cannot keep the track of the exact number. And what are these female preachers doing? They're basically preaching to women-only groups. One of the important functions of these female preachers is that they have a fatwa duty, that is to say they are also employed at the fatwa office of the Diyanet, that is to say they actually have access to directly answer the questions of pious people that direct their questions to Diyanet. And parallel to this dramatic increase in the number of female preachers in the body of the Diyanet, there is a simultaneous incorporation of the themes of family and women as themes into the Friday sermons. And the Friday sermons are centrally organized in Turkey by the Diyanet. And again, they play an extremely important role in the activities of the Diyanet outside the mosque. Just to give you an example, they organize visits to houses, so they don't only preach in mosques. They go to houses, they go to hospitals, they go to women's shelters, dormitories, nursing homes, and etc., and disseminate the conservative message of the government and the Diyanet through these religious services. So there have been a number of ethnographical, in fact, research on female preachers because it's such a novel development across the Muslim world. And there is a tendency in the literature to see this as feminization of the religious sphere, that's empowerment of women in the religious sphere. But I argue that if you look at the structure of the Diyanet and how Diyanet actually closely coordinates and monitors what these female preachers are doing, I argue that the space for this empowerment is actually quite limited. Another institution that I would like to briefly mention is the family guidance bureaus. Unlike female preachers, this is completely novel to the AKP era. The first family guidance bureau, and these bureaus are under the Diyanet, okay? First established in 2003, and as I said, function under the Department of Family and Religious Guidance. So Diyanet now has a separate, in its huge bureaucracy, they have a Department of Family and Religious Guidance. There is at least one bureau in all provincial and district capitals. Majority of the personnel of these family guidance bureaus are female, and according to Diyanet statistics, 80% of the consultants are women, and those women who are employed in these family guidance bureaus, because they come to contact with ordinary people and asking questions about quite private and intimate issues like your sex life, your relationship with your mother-in-law, and etc. They receive special training in rhetoric and communication skills. They are described as active centers, so similar to the female preachers, family guidance bureaus are very active in Diyanet's expansion outside the mosque. They visit wedding ceremonies, organize picnics, they organize marriage schools for engaged couples, and they openly actually declare that the main aim of these family bureaus are to encourage marriage and prevent divorce. So I want to conclude just to mention, what I argue here is that this desecularization, of which Diyanet is the main engine, is actually employed or initiated through these two different channels, the female preachers and the family guidance bureaus. Very recently, yet another dimension has been added to this process or institutional multiplication of Diyanet's role. It's in October 2017, the parliament passed a law allowing the muftis to perform and register civil marriages in Turkey, and this, as I said, another dimension that actually significantly increased the institutional capacity, but also public visibility of the Diyanet. The effects of this we are yet to see, but it's actually an important development, and the first marriage ceremony ever conducted by a mufti was in November 2017, and there is, of course, open support by the Diyanet to push for more marriage ceremonies conducted by the imams and the muftis employed by the Diyanet. And as I said, my argument is that the space for women's empowerment or any independent space for a female type of religiosity is extremely limited under the very hierarchical structure of the Diyanet. This is an expansion of the religious sphere, yes, through feminization, but nevertheless, this process disseminates a quite conservative patriarchal message imposed by the AKP government and in alliance with, of course, its conservative, or rather Islamist now, authoritarianism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sevgi, for this presentation. Now I would like to give the word to Eduard.
Yes, thank you, and thank you all. As you will see, we are changing somehow the focus, but there is a flow somehow, because it connects both with Gezi and also with the usage of religion and identity as a political tool. So here what I will try to look, because we were in a panel, or I was asked to speak in a panel about radical transformation, I tried to thought about the area I know the best, which is Turkish foreign policy. And I tried to ask whether, and to respond to the question about whether there has been a transformation and how radical this transformation has been, and which would have been the drivers of that transformation in the last decades. And thus, I mean, in this kind of circumstances, you always think, okay, how deep the transformation has been. Is it a transformation or is it just fine-tuning? So that was my main research question. So we have the, sorry, I was doing like this as if there was someone. So the first thing is since when? And then here, as you can see, I tried to look at some images that portray us to different moments in recent history at different levels. So here you have both global elements, regional and local ones. So some people would say that the transformation of Turkey, of Turkish foreign policy, is mainly related to global events, and here the end of the Cold War, that would be the most important factors. Others would look at regional dynamics, and here issues related to Turkey's neighborhood, so very much in particular Syria. That's why you have here the picture of Erdogan and Putin. That would be also another driver of this transformation. Just think that Turkey thought that 2011 uprisings was kind of an opportunity for the country and for its leadership, and that by 2016 it felt trapped in the middle of two difficult neighbors with whom they had difficult relations. Syria in the south, having conquered Aleppo, but then in the north, Russia, with whom they were at that time at odds, and then it started the process of reconciliation. Other people would look at domestic factors. Which kind of domestic factors? That could be a change of government, and that's the year 2002 has always been looked at as a turning point in Turkish foreign policy, because we would have a new vision and a new practice of foreign policy. That's why I put the picture of the Vatan Gazette with the after the elections. But others have looked at the transformation of the political system, which is something else. It's not about who rules, but how the system is being ruled. That's why I put here also the image of the referendum, the Evet Hayır. When we had the referendum in 2017, and then we had the transition from a kind of a parliamentary hybrid system towards a super presidential system in Turkey. But then we could look also at domestic factors which have less to do with the government, with the society, and this is Gezi, and I think we all agree that the Gezi event is a turning point in Turkish history that has, and this is something that perhaps has been studied less, but it has also ramifications in the way Turkey acts internationally. So here also when we talk about change vis-a-vis what? Which period are we comparing to? We could compare to the conventional Turkish foreign policy since the Republic, which I somehow conceptualize as Turkish foreign policy 1.0, and then, so it means in terms of being Western-oriented, militaristic, realist, status quo, has this changed and how radically has this changed, or whether it has changed from what was called new Turkish foreign policy, which it's no longer new, because that was the foreign policy design of Ahmet Davutoglu. So it would be one in which it would focus more on neo-Ottomanism, on soft power, hereby also aspects related to the use of religion and Diyanet also as a foreign policy tool, that aim at transform the neighborhood rather than to keep things as calm as possible, which was the status quo policy of before, which was idealist more than realist. It had a vision of what was to be achieved and what was to be done, and also a very ideologized foreign policy. And here, Pinar Bilgin has written wonderful stuff about that. So just I think these two pictures are very illustrative also of changes that have happened, changes in the decision-making system. One of the classical books on Turkish foreign policy analysis is this one by Philip Robbins from Oxford, Suits and Uniforms. And the idea was that foreign policy was the monopoly of these two clusters of people, the security establishment and the diplomats, and politicians had little impact on foreign policy. There was such a continuity, and it was these actors that were driving foreign policy. Then in the middle, we could have put something else, which is a moment in which foreign policy became more pluralistic. The moment in which, for instance, Islamist NGOs would have an impact on Turkish foreign policy. Let's think about the flotilla incident. Or situations also in which the business community would also have an influence on Turkish foreign policy when asking them to open new markets. So in the middle of these two situations, the traditional foreign policy and what we have now, there was a moment in which the key word, it would be this pluralization in the actors that were relevant and the actors that were influencing Turkish foreign policy. Now you can see that suits and uniforms are the same. Here you have the picture of Erdogan visiting the troops, I think it was in the Euphrates Shield mission. And no, not the Euphrates Shield, or in Afrin, that was the Afrin mission on Olive Branch. But you could see also this idea that everything is far more centralized. There has been a process, both in terms of the capacity of Erdogan to become the sole leader in the AKP, but also in a more procedural manner, also with the change of the presidential system, and as I was saying, this more hierarchical decision-making process in Turkish foreign policy. So this certainly is a change and quite a radical one. The other element is that now I would say Turkey's foreign policy is fear-driven. While I would say in the period 2011 to 2016, it was opportunity-driven. It saw opportunities that they wanted to seize. Since 2016, or even before, since 2015, there's a moment in which Turkey and its current leadership perceive that there is a proliferation of risks inside the country, so Gezi being very important, around the country, then difficult relations with Russia, and the evolution of the conflict in Syria, and also globally with tense relationships with the US and Europe. This is a picture you will all recognize of the failed coup attempt in Istanbul, and certainly this is one of the moments in which the perception of vulnerability of the regime would also increase. But it wasn't just one more element in a row, because, I mean, Gezi, in that respect, is as important. Why I put this weird picture which has nothing to do? Because this is part of a broader process which we are observing also in the Middle East. A situation in which it's not only Turkey but other Middle Eastern policies that are designing their foreign policy priorities and their strategies and actions based on fear. Fear of what? Fear of lagging behind, fear of missing the train, fear of what Bauman said, falling from the window of a fast accelerating vehicle. The idea is that they are no longer in control and that events could bypass them and put them in a difficult situation. All this create fear, create mistrust, generalized mistrust towards your own constituency, towards your neighbors, towards your international allies. And this is one of the elements of what I would say characterizes the way in which Turkey is now designing its foreign policies towards the Middle East. So in this moment, as I was mentioning, we have this series of events. Gezi, I mean, it's a moment in which Erdogan felt extremely contested and was facing a different kind of opposition. And here I think that what you mentioned about these different components coming together, even mobilizing sectors like, as you said, POs, Muslims against Erdogan, that was a big shock, I would say, for him. Then, obviously, we have the June elections of 2015, when the AKP lost the majority in parliament. And this, obviously, there's nothing a government could fear more than losing power, particularly when you have created so many enemies. So this is a moment in which all the alarms started to ring. Then the coup d'etat, then the fall of Aleppo, in which all the bets of Turkey in Syria were lost. And to some extent, but this is a question mark, something that we may debate, is that the results of the 2017 referendum and the 2018 presidential elections, although you could interpret them as a victory of the AKP and of Erdogan himself, the elections were won by such slim margin, despite all the advantage of the AKP and the Erdogan in the elections, that it could have only put the AKP and Erdogan in a more unsecure, or it would have only increased the perception of a vulnerability. And we may add that the results of this weekend local elections continue to reinforce this trend. Consequences of all of this, what we see is also that what we study in Turkey as a more polarized society, and there are extremely valuable analysis of public opinion conducted on this polarization in society. You have also seen a process of polarization in foreign policy, in which if you like Erdogan, you like his foreign policy. If you hate Erdogan, you hate his foreign policy. But also, this polarization also is reflected in speeches and in official speeches. And you always need to have some sort of external enemy to refer to and to try to cohesion your own group, particularly before elections. So we had also what was called the tulip crisis between the Netherlands and Turkey, in which both, by the way, the Netherlands and Turkey instrumentalized politically, and recently with the local elections, which have something similar with all the use and abuse of the terrorist attack in Christchurch in New Zealand, and the video of the attack being projected in electoral rallies, and using what could be seen as a Western-phobic rhetoric also on the part of Erdogan himself. We also need to add to this the fact that we have two intermestic polarizing factors. Intermestic because there are issues that are not purely domestic, not exclusively regional. On the one hand, we have the issue of the refugees, and the fact that in the last years we see also that there are also political parties instrumentalizing the rejection of refugees. I've seen also, for instance, some of the electoral signs of E-party also targeting Syrians. So this is not also a joke. There is this anti-Syrian feeling that is glooming in some parts of the country, where it serves also the opposition to accuse Erdogan of all the failures in this foreign policy towards Syria, and now we have to deal with these 3 million Syrians, and this is having consequences on our jobs, and this is having consequences on our neighborhoods, and on the daily security of our wives and sisters when they walk in the street. So this is an issue that certainly is contributing also to this polarization logic. And the other one, obviously, which has always been, and this is not a change, it has been a trend, a long term, which is the Kurdish issue, and particularly because of the events on the ground in Syria and the consolidation of the YPG as a key actor, and the fact that in the YPG rallies and any public display, Öcalan also figures prominently. So this is also increasing this polarization of foreign policy when it comes particularly to Syria. Here, obviously, the polarization, it may serve to rely somehow of a nationalistic trend vis-a-vis the YPG, but also, obviously, it also creates tensions between the government and the HDP, which is another form of polarization, of portraying part of your citizens and of your representatives in the parliament as enemies of the nation. So to conclude, I think that we could say that it's more than fine-tuning, that this change that we have been witnessing compared to the previous traditional foreign policy, but also from the new Turkish foreign policy, is the result of a combination of these 3 layers of analysis, of domestic, regional, and global, and we have to introduce the 3 of them. And I would say that compared to the previous period, in which ambition and hope was the key driver of change, now it's fear what is driving this change, which I don't know how radical it is, but certainly, as I was mentioning, it's more than fine-tuning.
Splendid. Thank you so much, Eduard, and thank you to all 3 of you for these interesting presentations. I hope you have lots of questions, and I would like to give the word to the floor. Please identify yourself briefly and say who you are directing the question at.
Hello, good morning. I'm Dario. I'm a student at eBay in Barcelona. My question is, it's directed both to Seigi and Eduard. It's related to the intersection between what you were talking about, the Diyanet, and the foreign policy of the Diyanet. I'm really interested to know how does the Diyanet extend or expand its influence in other continents, especially Africa. We are seeing the Diyanet trying to compete with other spheres of other Islamic branches, such as the Saudi, especially the Saudi tradition of trying to expand its soft power Islamic influence in many continents through the investment and infrastructure of mosques. But I think there's also been this trend since the AKP has gotten into power, following the same sort of strategy that the Saudis used to follow. And so I would like to ask exactly what are we witnessing in terms of this Diyanet influence offshore? Is this a rising soft power of Turkish foreign policy combined with Islamic influence, or is this something that maybe existed before the rise of the AKP? Well, what is your opinion on that? Thank you very much.
Do you want to go first?
If you want, I can start, yeah. So first thing, indeed, I mean, DNet is being used as a tool also of some soft power, of influence. And what you were mentioning also about this rivalry also with other countries' soft policy tools, it's particularly relevant because, as you were pointing out, the Saudi factor is there. Saudi and Turkey Arabia are at odds. I mean, just think about the Khashoggi scandal, but also the support of Turkey to Qatar. So it's an issue. I've never done research before, but it would be very interesting in the sense of analyzing also in places where both may be competing, something particularly Horn of Africa. That would be super interesting also to look at how DNet and Saudi proselytism instruments function. Libya, it would be, again, another fascinating case. Yet, DNet has not only been used to, let's say, to expand some sort of influence of the Turkish version of Islam outside Turkey. It's also used also to control Turks abroad. This is another key element. And this perhaps you could explain more about how, I mean, when does it start or whether this has happened always, but I would say that there is a moment where it is, I mean, say also after the coup d'etat, after the open war with the Fethullah Gulen group. I mean, obviously this role was reinforced, and we see that how in many European countries with large Turkish diasporas, I'm thinking about Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, France, Sweden, Denmark. I mean, this is an issue which is also raising increased concerns also from the national governments in Europe, and which could create tension. So obviously, Turkey is in need to explain that by investing on DNet, it's a way also of creating conditions for moderate Islam, stop radicalization process and so on. But then also, you could also see it as a tool of control over diasporas. And final point from my side, this is not exceptional to Turkey. There are many other countries that do the same and follow exactly the same strategy. And if anyone would be interested in following that approach, I would say that comparing Moroccan and Turkish approach and uses of religion as a foreign policy tool on the one hand, but then also as a tool to control diasporas, it's super fascinating. I've never done that research, but it is something that I would encourage someone to do. And then, because then you could see also how Morocco now in Africa, in West Africa, it's also trying to go with female preachers, so exactly the same, and also putting emphasis on Sufi Islam as a way to offer a different vision of Islam as compared to the one coming from Saudi Arabia, and as something that allows them to gain influence locally in those countries, but most importantly, it's also seen as a message to the international community. We are spreading the nice version of Islam, the less dangerous version of Islam. So we should be supported, and these efforts that we are doing also should be encouraged.
I will just add that, I mean, as I mentioned, my research is not on Diyanet's activities outside Turkey, but there's a growing literature on that, as Eduard mentioned, particularly on Diyanet activities in Western Europe and also especially in the Balkans. What I can say is that certainly these activities didn't start with the AKP. As far as I know, certainly they started after the 1980 military coup and the dramatic shift of Diyanet, as I mentioned, the second phase of transformation after the military coup with the policies of this Turco-Islamic synthesis of the military regime, etc. But I would say that it dramatically shifted with the AKP, and I think particularly under the prime ministry of Ahmet Davutoğlu, it sort of complemented this idealist foreign policy that Eduard outlined in his presentation. This idea of particularly using Diyanet, the number of mosques, the number of Diyanet personnel that were sent to abroad increased dramatically. And what I found fascinating, again, I didn't do my research on this, but I have been reading other colleagues working on this, is that the degree of expansion of, for example, the schools they run in these mosques, the Quran courses they run, and they now started to actually train their own imams because there have been some pressure especially from some Western European countries for the Diyanet to cut its link, at least not to send imams directly from Turkey. Now the Diyanet actually tries to train its own imams, that is to say, like people have double citizenship, so that they would continue to control the mosques under the Diyanet. And as far as I know, the literature now is more focused, as Eduard said, rather than Turkey's soft power, that idealist vision of exporting Turkish Islam, blah, blah, blah. It's more, I think, concentrated on now diaspora management. That is, keeping the Turkish diaspora under control. And actually, I mean, don't forget, it's a very important electoral reservoir, the reserve for the AKP, the votes coming from outside.
From Rabat, it's okay. Mustafa Kadiri from Rabat University in Morocco. I'm very curious because I deal with anthropological history and I try to recover by the past to understand what happened today regarding this 20th century. It means something like, because just before the World War I, we hear about Islamic policies, Muslim policies, Islam puissances, not only the Ottoman Empire, including France, for example, itself as an Islamic power in that time. Anyway, we are in a context as we recover something with playing with words. Like, for example, today, we hear about the Islamophobia. I think it is Islamismophobia. And Erdogan is playing with, like, you quote about what happened in New Zealand. It's Islamismophobia, but he is trying to deal with as it means Islamophobia because poor Muslims are badly seen in world affairs anyway regarding terrorist attacks, etc. And my question is so simple. Can we talk, regarding international challenges and local challenges of Turkey, of a soft new Wahhabism AKP ideology? Because putting Turks to wear, for women and men, of course, this imagined clothes, Islamic clothes with the scarf, veil, I don't know, kashabiyah for men, etc. Because I read several papers from 70s, there was an impact by Saudi Arabia, money and ideology too. Can we talk about the new soft Wahhabism from Turkish case study? Thank you.
It is very difficult to answer. I don't think so. I'm not sure. I mean, there are people, mostly not scholars, but definitely there are some scholars as well mentioning influence of Wahhabism. But I'm not sure how strong the influence is. At least I can't tell from my research. Yeah. Maybe Eduard.
No, to me, I would say that Turkey has always tried to present its own model rather than copying others' model, and I would say that they've perceived this as a strength. And now, in the current geopolitical context, it's even more important for Turkey to present itself and its own model as exactly the opposite of the one presented by Saudi Arabia. And I would say that even if we, and this, you may know much more than I do, but in terms of the Islamization of the Turkish society, what's what you are referring in terms of clothing, attitudes, and so on, there have been, I remember a long time ago reading something from Minas Toprak, on this, in which they were showing that in fact it's not that it has increased so much in terms of the wearing of the headscarf and so on, but it's just that it became more visible also because of rural to urban changes, but also to something that we should all welcome, which is the fact that people that were coming from a poorer background were becoming better off in society, and then they became more visible also in the classical thing, in shopping malls. But if you look also at the, I would say, as opposition to what you could be suggesting, there is a need, I would say, from Erdogan or from his party to show that among its own constituency, it's not only the headscarf women that are there. They always need also to show this plurality of the Turkish society. So that would be, and I would say that it's not only in the AKP. Now you can see also CHP, that sometimes you can see also, what was the name? Now I have a lapsus of the presidential candidate of the... From Ince. Do you remember the picture also with Ince's mother?
Of course. And also in the recent elections, the local elections, the candidate for mayorship of Istanbul used extensively his background, like being, I think, a grandson of an imam. Yeah. His mother is veiled.
So this is changing, I would say, even if we see this increased polarization in political views, in that particular segment of life, perhaps there is less polarization than the Turkey I first knew when I first went to Turkey in the early 2000s.
Again, it's very difficult to quantify and measure these things. Really we don't know how many women, whether there is a significant increase under the AKP government in the number of women veiled. But I don't think, from just an observation, I haven't done research on this particularly. I've worked on veiling, but in a very different context in the 1930s, not in contemporary Turkey. But I don't think, for example, there's a particular difference in terms of the veil, like the style of veil that has been used. So I don't see, in that sense, a Wahhabi influence or anything. And in terms of political ties, I think AKP has been quite open in its political ties with the Muslim Brotherhood tradition, I would say. Very, very open.
And let me add something also for ask you your opinion on this. What I've been told recently is that particularly in cities like Istanbul, there is an increased, I would say, Arabophobia, if you want, vis-a-vis associating Arabs with the people from the Khalij, from the Gulf.
Gulf.
So in that sense, I would say the attire of the Gulf, or anything that would resonate or would connect with the Gulf, is something that it's not particularly popular in Turkey nowadays. Quite the opposite.
Quite the opposite, quite the opposite.
I'm Julide. I'm doing a PhD at UABE, and I have a question for you about Turkish foreign policy. And because you said that Turkish foreign policy now is fear-driven, and you gave some examples why they feel more vulnerable than before. And I was wondering if you could give some examples how this manifests itself in some foreign policy activities or strategies where we can see that it is fear-driven, or where we can see that this has changed. Thank you.
So just to take one example, the most classical one, that would be on the tensions with the US. In principle, Turkey is a NATO member. They should look at the US as a security provider. And yet, because of the choices of the US in Syria in support of the YPG, or providing assistance to the YPG, but also for the perceived lack of solidarity of the US and the broad NATO family after or during, even more, the coup attempt, there is this feeling that, no, I cannot, my allies may not be an asset, but rather a liability. So this, normally in Turkey, and it's not the first time that it happens, because we all know this concept of the Sèvres syndrome in 1918, there is this feeling of, I can only rely on myself. I have no friends. This normally what it translates is also into a more in downscaling of priorities. You care about what it is perceived as to being essential, and also a reliance on the military apparatus. So militarization, arguably, I mean, for those also doing research right now, also because we have two military operations, Euphrates Shield and Olive Branch, in that sense, it may be responding also to that particular trend. You could also talk, I mean, similarly about this mistrust and fear towards the Europeans, but I would say less so. It is perceived as less threatful, and that's why it's more often instrumentalized also in political campaigns than the US. And I would say also then, I mean, the situation in Syria itself, how it has evolved on the military front. Also, it's an element that increased significantly the fears of Turkey of being the loser of the game. I mean, Turkey has made a bet for the fall of Assad, closing their eyes to some things that were happening because they were supporting the fall of Assad as what they thought was needed in Syria and what would also benefit Turkish foreign policy, and they found themselves in 2016 in a completely different situation in which the rebels were screwed up and the Assad was winning militarily, and on top of it you had the Kurds of the YPG SDFs becoming a key player in northeastern Syria with the support of the US, France, and others. So it was kind of a nightmare and a situation which forced Turkey to really review its foreign policy priorities. And I would argue that, and this is a mistake that some people have done, we have to interpret the reconciliation between Turkey and Russia in that vein. The reconciliation between Russia and Turkey did not happen as a result of the coup d'etat attempt, but it started a week before. That's the moment in which Erdogan apologized for the shutting down of the two planes. Then after the coup d'etat, it increased the conditions for which, I mean, because of this mistrust between Erdogan and its allies, Putin was able also to use that situation to bring Turkey closer to them. And Turkey needed that Russian support, or Russian support, in order to launch the first operations in Syria. Otherwise, they knew it was too risky. So all of this, as I said, to me, it's a completely different paradigm and different, what the French would say, état d'âme, a different mood, than the one in 2011, a situation in which Turkey only perceived opportunities with the fall of Mubarak and the arrival of a new leader in Egypt when Morsi was elected, opportunities in Syria because it was the possibility of connecting with the people of the region and being their, the reference of their expectations. So really, as I said, 2011 was a moment in which Turkey said, okay, let's seize all those opportunities. Now, since 2016, is how do you manage all those threats and all those fears?
Try to keep it brief. Introduce yourself briefly.
Yes.
And quick
Thank you very much for presentation. My name is Gökhan Subay. I'm student of Master of International Security in eBay with Dario. My question goes to Özdüzen. What is the differences between West protester, a yellow vest in France at Gezi Park? Because in West, yellow vest got some concessions from Macron, but during Gezi events, Erdogan didn't give any concession to protesters because they were not voter of the Erdogan. And second question, local elections already finished. Republican Party won the Istanbul, but Justice and Development Party says that it was because of the miscalculation of votes. We won, we will look for our rights. So let's say after objection of the miscalculation, so-called miscalculation of votes, we can expect new Gezi events, because during Gezi events there was no leader. Now they have leader named Ekrem İmamoğlu. Maybe he can be leader of the new events. So we can expect new protests if this happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your questions. In regards to the first question about the Yellow Vest kind of its similarity or difference to Gezi protest, I mean, Yellow Vest was a more of like Gezi, as I said, was a response to AKP's use of urban space as a control mechanism. But Yellow Vest was more was a response to governmental policies, not particularly through space making, I think. And also like in Gezi protests, it was related to the authoritarian politics of the AKP. I mean, yes, the Yellow Vest is also a response to the authoritarian policies in France, but it was more about, in a way, labor rights, kind of more of a response to occupational safety, also the increase because of the rise in gas and all these sorts of like prices. But I mean, Gezi, of course, as I said, it was a little bit of, it had anti-capitalist dimension, a noteworthy anti-capitalist dimension. But at that point in Turkey, there wasn't, it was kind of ongoing economic recession also, but not necessarily. Like now, Turkey is kind of facing more of an economic crisis at this point. But at that point, it wasn't. It was more of an alienation of multiplicity of populaces from the AKP politics. Like right before, for instance, the Gezi protests, there were like feminist movements against the discussions of the government about abortion, the bans of abortion. So the feminists also used various parts of Istanbul to go against these policies. And then there was also bans of alcohol. So it was in addition to some economic contexts, it was a lifestyle, in a way, movement also, like because of the restrictions in everyday life, like from consumption of alcohol to, women's rights. I mean, of course, labor rights or economic kind of concerns was a constituent of it, but not predominantly, I'd say. So it was more a kind of reaction to authoritarian politics as well as urban lands, the rent, kind of the commodification of Istanbul, and kind of pushing minority groups out of Taksim, pushing, non-Sunni Turks out of the central parts of Istanbul through commodification of the land. So, I mean, I think their focuses are a bit different, but still, like, I think they feed each other, all these kind of cycle of protest movements. In regards to your second question about the Kemalist, the kind of conventional Kemalist party, CHP's kind of regaining Istanbul municipality, I think if there is a miscalculation, the so-called miscalculation, there will again be some protests, but because now the police forces act almost like a paramilitary forces, like obviously AKP had kind of abolish the military system in a way. Like that's the in their first phase of having power from 2002 to 2007, a lot of liberals in Turkey actually celebrated the kind of abolishing of the military aspect of Turkey, which has long kind of created a backlash for Turkey, not in terms of foreign policy, but also in terms of kind of people's life in the ground. But they, in fact, replaced this military power with their own civil police forces, because police has so much freedom at this point. I mean, I tried to show that because I had limited time on the 2017 video. Like, they have so much power and presence in all central parts of Istanbul, as well as, of course, Kurdish region. I mean, more and more. I mean, of course, Kurdish region was also kind of full of police and military forces before, but now AKP kind of reinforced, reconsolidated this power. So even if there will be some protests, maybe it's going to be repressed very quickly, but it's still a moment of hope, I believe, like because they came to power through gaining control of Istanbul, because Erdogan was the first Islamist kind of municipal leader of Istanbul in 1990s, actually, the end of 1990s. So that's how he legitimized his power. So maybe there's a chance now to kind of at least balance out that, at least to kind of, because they will, I think, eventually, if they lose power in Istanbul and Ankara, then because they gain so much control of urban commodification, urban land, there is not so much industry outside of that. So the economic crisis owes back to that as well, also. So maybe that will create a new hope, and then maybe that will create new people, new groups coming back to the streets, so that they feel more self-confident and all that. So I hope I answered your questions.
Do we still have time? Okay. So I'm afraid we'll have to close this session. So thanks again to the presenters, and thanks to you and your questions. You made it very, very interesting, this first panel, so thank you. Thank you. And thanks to you.